A little while ago, a subscriber came to me and said that the Mistercraft F-86 was the worst kit they ever built, and that got me thinking, how bad can it be? I've built quite a few bad kits in my time, and I wonder how bad this one will be. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Mistercraft CL-13 or F-86 Sabre in 1/72 scale. Let's get into it. So yeah, as mentioned, I picked this one up because I was told that it was the worst kit they'd built, and I just wanted to explore that and see if it really was that bad. I have already done an unboxing on this, so for a more detailed look inside the box at the contents, including the plastic parts and the transfers, take a look at this one. In this one, I'll be building it and seeing how much fun, or how difficult it is to complete. As normal, I will be cutting away the parts from the sprue using my side cutters and cleaning up any flash or rough areas with a sanding stick or knife. The mould quality of this kit is pretty acceptable, but there are some areas of flash that need addressing, and the plastic has a slightly odd chalky texture to it. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice during this build, and the first things to be assembled were the air intakes and nose gear bay. This comes in a number of different parts and was a little fiddly to put together, but after a little perseverance I got where I needed to be. After this I then moved on to the cockpit assembly. There is a cockpit tub and a representation of a chair gets glued in here, as well as a control stick and control panel. The nose gear bay and air intake is then added into the correct position inside the fuselage, and you might be able to notice a big Hella logo on this part here, so it's not a native Mistercraft tooling. Following on from this, the cockpit assembly was glued into its relevant position as well. The tail exhaust component was glued into position at the back of the fuselage. To prevent the aircraft from sitting on its tail, I'm going to glue some liquid gravity as far forwards as possible. I used some super glue to hold it into place around the cockpit and nose wheel bay. With that done, I then glued the fuselage halves together. After this, I then added on the part which goes at the front of the aircraft. There is a slight seam down the fuselage, so I used a sanding stick to try and clean this up. You do get the option to display the air brake in an open or closed position. I decided I would have mine closed simply for ease of construction. After this, I joined the lower wings onto the main body of the fuselage. This was then followed by joining the upper wing components, and then after this, the tail surfaces were glued into their slots on the back of the model. I would build up the external fuel tanks, and these come in a number of parts. The main bodies are joined together. The little fins are then glued into their slots at the back, and what I believe is the fuel transfer pipe is then glued into the slot on the side. These were then glued into the holes on the lower side of the wing. If you didn't want to have your drop tanks installed, you would have to fill and clean up those holes. After this, I glued in the nose landing gear leg, making sure to not forget the little support strut. This was followed by gluing into place the main door. I can now turn my attention to the main landing gear. The small door is glued into position, the landing gear leg added, and then the outer doors for the legs added as well. I will leave the wheels off until they've been painted. And now it's time to prime. It's on my t-shirt. I'm going to use an Old Faithful here, which is the Humbrol No. 1 grey primer, and this was simply sprayed onto the entire aircraft at this point. This should give a good surface for the subsequent layers of paint to stick to. The first paint I'm going to use when that was all dry was some Vallejo white. I've decided that this will be thinned down with a little thinner just to make it flow a little better. As I'm going to replicate the RAF paint scheme included in this set, there is a white band on the tail. And as this is a kind of back to basics build, everything will be hand painted from this point on. A couple of thin layers of this white paint was brushed onto this area, working in alternative directions to try and minimise any visible brush strokes from being seen in the finished paint layers. After this, I would paint some Vallejo black onto some areas of the cockpit. The majority of the cockpit will just be left in the primer grey colour, as according to my research, aircraft of this type would have had a primarily grey internal cockpit area. Whilst I've got this paint out, the wheels would also be painted in this colour. Umbral 62, which is a leather colour, was used to pick out the headrest of the pilot's seat. I then masked up the white band, and a little extra white paint was used just on the outside of this tape to act as a kind of layer and prevent any paint from seeping underneath it. For the lower side of the aircraft, I'm going to use this Umbral number 230. This is a PRU blue. All of these paints may be thinned down a little bit with some thinner that we saw previously. This was a simple process to carefully paint the lower side with a couple of thin coats of this colour. The thinner will help to avoid leaving any brush strokes as it increases the drying time and allows the paint to self-level. Once that was done, I would move on to the top surface of the plane. So for the top surface, I'm going to use Umbral 164, which is a dark sea grey. Once again thinned down with a few drops of thinner, this would be carefully hand painted onto the upper surfaces. I'm not using any masking tape for my camouflage scheme. All I'm going to do is very carefully apply the camouflage using my hand painting skills. This does take a little bit of patience and time to ensure your brushes go in the right place. If I do get any paint in the wrong places, I'll just go back over it with some of the correct colour. I had to be careful around the areas with the white paint, as painting white over a darker colour can be quite difficult. So it would be best to not make a mistake here and get it right first time. The next paint to use was this Umbral 116 US Dark Green. Again thinned down with a couple drops of thinner, this would be hand painted on in a camouflage scheme using the guidance provided by the instructions. Again, this would be done by hand, just very carefully applying the paint to avoid it going in the wrong places. And with that dry, I carefully removed the masking tape for the white band, and it seems to have done a pretty reasonable job. To give the aircraft a uniform finish and prepare it for decals, some Umbral clear gloss was painted over the entire model. I'm hoping that this will help prevent any silvering being visible, but I have struggled with Mistercraft decals in the past as they're not the best quality, and this step should try and prevent silvering, but I'm not sure that it will. And speaking of the decals, you get quite a few sheets in this kit. As this is a special paint release, you actually get 11 paint schemes included. Naturally, you can only pick one. I identified the transfers that I would need for my RAF version, and then carefully cut them from the main sheets into more manageable sections. For these ones, I'm going to be using some micro-scale liquid decal film. This was painted onto the top of the transfers, and from previous experience I know that they tend to disintegrate, so this liquid decal film is going to act as a protective layer and bond them together to prevent disintegration. And just to make sure that I'm not being crazy and that Mistercraft transfers are still not fantastic, I'm going to try out a couple of the other ones which I'm not using. So just as a trial, I dipped them in warm water and began to slide them off the backing paper. You can see on this red roundel that around the edges it has started to flake. Also, the registration isn't fantastic. The red is off-center to the white. I then applied it onto these extra drop tanks which are included in the kit, but I don't need them, and you can see that they just aren't sticking to the surface, and the surface has a slightly weird kind of crackle effect going on them. So I thought that I would try one from the white backing paper as well, because they might be slightly different. I'm going to use a little bit of micro set as a setting solution to try and soften them down, which doesn't seem to be doing anything to the red circle. And when I came to apply the black cross, it fell apart. So that's not ideal, is it? These transfers on the white sheets tend to be a little bit thinner, and they do actually conform better, but they disintegrate more. And actually, it's been about a month since I did that little test, and I have it here, and you can see that in that time, I've not put anything on the top to protect them. They've just been sitting on my workbench. I've not done anything with them. The red one has disintegrated and snapped and just flaked off. The black one has also disintegrated around the edges, but it's still there. But, you know, these are not great transfers. These are, wow, we could have better, couldn't we? So hopefully what I've done with the transfers, I am going to use that liquid decal film, should try and protect them. But yeah, I thought I would just try them out, because some people have said when you do your reviews, you always say about how you've had bad experiences, but you never prove it. So in this one, I'd like to say that, you know, we have seen that they don't work so well. But moving back to my actual decal application, I'm going to use micro set and sol, as is quite normal. I dip the transfers into warm water just as before to release them, and then carefully slide them into the relevant positions. Micro set from the blue bottle has been applied, and hopefully should settle them into the surface details. Fortunately, there aren't a great deal of decals that I need for the RAF version, so I made relatively quick progress here, and actually I didn't have that much in the way of tearing or splitting, because the liquid decal film I've applied seems to be working. Unfortunately though, they don't really seem to be settling into the surface details, even despite excessive amounts of the setting solutions being applied. So I left them to dry a little bit, and then I came back about a day later to use some Humbrol decal fix. This is a little more aggressive and acts a little bit more like a glue for decals. I applied this onto the decals a number of times as well, hoping that it will help settle them down and stick them onto the surface. After a day or so, they seem to be pretty much there, so I'm going to move on. Gloss varnish, which I used previously, and this was painted over the entire aircraft. What this is going to do is help protect those decals from flaking off, and hopefully act a bit more like a glue and help seal them in. Unfortunately though, it does appear that I've got a bit of silvering where the decal film has little air bubbles underneath it, but this seems to be a common complaint with Mistercraft transfers. Oh well, I'm going to just move on. Humbrol 78, which is a cockpit green colour, was used to carefully pick out the internal areas of the landing gear bays. In hindsight, I kind of wish I'd done that before I painted the lower surfaces blue, as this was quite tricky to avoid getting it on those blue surfaces. But with that done, I moved on to this matte aluminium colour. That was applied to the internal areas of the landing gear doors, as well as the landing gear legs, and I would very carefully apply it to the hubs of the landing gear wheels. Next, I would use some gunmetal, and this would be painted onto the exhaust pipe area of the aircraft. It's time to add a little bit of weathering, so I've got this Humbrol blue-grey wash, and as it's enamel, I'm going to thin it down with some white spirit. This will just make it a little bit thinner and not so thick. I would apply this to the entirety of the aircraft, in particular the landing gear bays, but also all the other elements. This kit features raised panel lines, and I'm hoping that working in the direction of airflow, these raised panel lines will sort of accumulate this dirt and grime and highlight them a little bit. When that was dry, I glued on the wheels to their relevant landing gear legs, taking care to make sure that I didn't get any glue on any of the painted surfaces and ruin the look. And then to dull down that gloss finish I applied earlier, this Humbrol number 49 matte varnish was carefully sprayed onto the entire model. This will help dull everything down and make it look a little less shiny. I haven't done anything with the cockpit canopy yet, and all I'm going to do with this is simply paint it freehand. The canopy frames are relatively proud from the plastic, and all I did was carefully paint them with the edge of my brush. I made sure to paint the front part of the canopy in the green, and the framework around the rear part of the canopy in the grey. Humbrol Clear Fix would then be used to glue these onto the aircraft. I did take care to not get this glue in the wrong places. It is a bit stringy and I worry I could make a mess. With the rear canopy part, there is a small component which needs to be glued in before I add it to the model, and this was done here. This has already been suitably painted. I decided I would glue this one in an open position, but you could glue it closed if you wanted to as well. There are a couple of landing lights which are not yet added to the model, and there are 2 holes on the lower side of the nose. They were carefully positioned using the same glue as before. And whilst this is technically not a part that needs adding, I found that the pitot tube, which is moulded into the wing, kept falling off. So I actually had to reattach this a number of times during the build, and this was the final time I reattached it. And that's it. That's as far as I went with my build of the Mistercraft F-86 in 1/72 scale. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, seeing as I was told it was the worst kit this person had ever built, I think that they're quite fortunate that this was the worst one, because I have built much worse kits than this. Granted, as we probably discovered during the build, that this is actually a Hella tooling. And the tooling dates from 1979, so it's not particularly terrible as far as, you know, the sort of Hella 70s/80s kits were. I built the F-84 recently, and that was objectively quite nice as well. Granted, it's nowhere near modern standards. It doesn't have recessed panel lines, it doesn't have the finesse of details, but it still fits together pretty well. So the tooling itself is pretty decent. It's not too bad. To be honest though, Mistercraft can't really take credit for the tooling. And there were some little bits of flash and things in places, and also that slightly chalky and grainy plastic that they use isn't fantastic. Some of the details didn't feel as crisp as they probably would have been if it was a Hella produced version of the kit. So the kit I've got here, this version, I picked it up not long ago. I think I picked it up last year, so 2024, and I built it in 2024. Is actually a 2018 production, but they seem to be quite readily available, so I wonder if they've had it on a sort of continuous production release for a while. If you notice down here, it does say that this is new, but it's probably new to Mistercraft, because as we've discussed, it's not exactly a new kit. One of the benefits of this kit is that you get so many different paint schemes to choose from. The downside, of course, is that the instructions aren't that clear on how you're going to apply those paint schemes, and also the issues we've discovered with the decals, being thin, flaky, prone to tearing and silvering despite my best efforts to try and prevent that. It seems to be a consistent problem with Mistercraft transfers, and you know, I would be happy to have less decal schemes in a box if the transfers were a better quality. Especially when you consider the fact that this kit is retailing in the UK for about £15. That seems a bit high for what we're getting in the kit. We're getting an old tooling with not particularly the best quality and those really questionable decals. It is probably worth mentioning that I think you could raise the landing gear on this. You could just glue those panels in place. You may have to do modification with the front one because that one looks like it's kind of folded anyway. You may need to make a replacement part, but no pilot or display stand is included, so you would have to source some for yourself. But yeah, the price for this kit doesn't seem particularly right, especially given that Mistercraft is recommending this retail price to be €19.99, which if we convert it to pound sterling is about £16.55. So I would probably be looking for a different brand, which would probably be cheaper. Hella do have a release of this kit in their range as a starter set with paints and glue, granted with less paint schemes, but only for €9.99, so read into that how you will. As always, I'm looking through my diary just to make sure that I've not forgotten anything, and if you want copies of your own to keep a track of your own builds, links are in the description. But I have forgotten to mention something. So in this, I know I mentioned about the registration and the decal quality, but there is even a misprint. So on one of the letter A's on the tail of my aircraft, you can see that there's a misprint where it's like almost printed twice. I just left it. I didn't address it. I probably could have cut it out and removed it, but I didn't bother. So yeah, I've written here, it's not terrible. The fit was pretty good. It's generally okay to build, and I think my build of it was okay, but the decals are the main problem. Yes, the plastic parts have got some slight mold quality issues with the fact that, you know, it's not as crisp, it's not as, the plastic isn't as good, but it's the decals. It's the decals. It's every time it comes to Mistercraft, it's the decals. They need better quality transfers. They were prone to tearing and falling apart. So I would say it's not the worst kit that I've ever built, but it's far from the best. And on that bombshell, I think it's probably time to end this one here. Let me know what you think of my build in a back to basics kind of style down in the comments below, and if my review of this kit was fair. As always, shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for helping to fuel my plastic addiction so I can share it with all of you. If you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, full information is underneath the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Mistercraft F-86 build. Yeah, that'd do. Right. To prevent the